Hello, friends, and welcome back to the History Nerd Podcast. I want to do this episode a little different from the last, so with that being said, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. Now, if you ever find yourself at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, you might stumble upon an exhibit of two maneless male lions. Now, at first glance, one could pass them up. There's a lot of things on display there. What makes these two lions so special? Well, I'll tell you. In the late 1800s was the Great Scramble for Africa. Now, if a European power wanted to establish itself as a superiority, it needed colonies in Africa. And in 1896, the British government set about building a railway system that would link Uganda to the Indian Ocean. Now, this is colonial East Africa. There were dangers involved in completing this task. You had disease, you had dangerous predators, and tribes that didn't want this project completed. Now, in 1898, the Uganda Railway brought in a British officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson. His objective was to oversee the building of a bridge in Tsavo, Kenya. So Patterson would arrive in March of that year. Now, the railway camp was formed of several thousand Indian workers, many local Africans, and after only a few days of his arrival at the railway, the workers began to experience attacks, and the attacks they began to experience were by a pair of lions. Now, these workers were all sleeping in tents. Now, these tents, when you think about them, they're big old school army tents you would see in a lot of old movies and things like that. So it would just be a canvas tent with a pole in the middle and a flap door and a bare ground inside. There was no bottom to the tent. So all these workers would share these style of tents. Now, on one night in the beginning of March, a lion snuck into a tent and bit a worker in the throat and dragged him out. Now, his tent mates are looking on in horror as this monster disappeared into the darkness with their friend. Now, the next day, a search party was put together and they went to look for the body. Now, they eventually discovered it, but when they discovered it, it was half eaten and was just torn apart. What they also discovered, and this is really fascinating and really scary when you think about it, was patches of his skin were missing, but the flesh wasn't eaten. The flesh was dry of blood, though. Apparently, what lions do in this case is their tongue is extremely coarse, and it's coarse enough and strong enough when they lick continuously the skin, they lick the skin off, and they would suck blood out of it. They would just sit there and suck the blood dry like some macabre treat that is like a mid-meal side dish. Now, the first thought people would have would be to assemble a team and hunt them down. Now, these men tried to set up watches and stop lions from coming in the camp anymore at night. One of the main problems were there are various camps scattered over an 8-mile radius. So it's hard to pinpoint when a lion's going to attack again because they have such a large hunting ground. Now, one thing they would try to do is build a protective wall around the camp. Now, after the first attack, they started to get a little skittish, and then a couple nights later, they had another attack, so they got to stop them from coming in. So they built what is known as bomas. And now you can still see bomas being used in a lot of rural places in Africa. They are made of whistling thorn. Now, the best way I could describe this to you is think of a rose bush. Now, imagine if it were like a tree and it had branches that were several inches thick. Now, they would cut these branches and stack them up like 10 feet high and make a fence around the camp. It was hoping that this would deter the lions from coming in at night. Unfortunately, it didn't deter them at all. The lions started jumping the bomas and they would grab workers and drag them out every night. There was this one instance where the water carrier for the camp hospital was taken out in the middle of the night, and it's described in really good detail in Patterson's book. And these are Patterson's words. The water carrier appears to have been lying on the floor with his head towards the center of the tent, his feet nearly touching the side. The lion managed to get its head below the canvas and seized him by the foot and pulled him out. And in desperation, the unfortunate water carrier clutched hold of a heavy box in a vain attempt to prevent being carried off, and dragged it with him until he was forced to let go of it by being stopped by the side of the tent. He then caught hold of the tent rope and clung tightly to it until it broke, and as soon as the lion managed to get him clear of the tent, he sprang at his throat, and after a few vicious shakes, the poor water carrier's agonizing cries were silenced forever. The brute then seized him in the mouth, like a huge cat with a mouse, and ran up and down the boma walls looking for a weak spot to break through. This he presently found, and plunged into it, dragging his victim with him, and leaving torn cloth and flesh as ghastly evidence of his passage through the thorns. Pretty vivid stuff that they were going through at the time. Patterson, as I said, arrived in March, and within 3 days, these attacks started happening, and it just went from 0 to 100 overnight. They just started coming and breaching them every day, and I don't understand how after all these attacks started happening, these people didn't just walk off the job. I mean, am I wrong? I realize it's 1898. Times are hard. But these people probably weren't being paid very well anyway. And every night you have to wonder, is tonight the night a lion's going to bite me in the throat while I'm sleeping and drag me out to the jungle to be eaten alive? It's nuts, man. These men lived in sheer fear all night and had to work all day under the African sun doing dangerous work on a railroad. And people back then were really suspicious. And since the lions didn't start attacking till after Patterson arrived, and then they just started attacking with such force and such ferocity, they blamed Patterson for the lions. They had gotten so terrified by this point, they didn't even think they were lions. They thought they were demons taking the form of a lion to punish them. Now, a lot of people are probably sitting there wondering, it's like, well, wait a minute, why are these lions attacking and eating people? The answer is actually a really simple one. Most of these workers were from India. Now, they were working under super dangerous conditions. People died a lot. Now, in the Hindu faith, they cremate the bodies. Now, the common thought now is that the lions started initially scavenging the cremation sites and developed a taste for human meat. Now, also, a lot of locals didn't bury people that deep, so scavengers would dig up the graves and eat the corpses. Now, these conditions are understandably sending these people into a panic. Progress is slowing down because they were exhausted and they have to keep taking time off to reinforce their campsite. Now, they eventually built the boma so thick and tall, the lions couldn't get through and the attacks stopped for a while. There was a 3-week period of peace. But see, when there's peace, there's a sense of safety, and people start letting their guards down. So by this point, it's now the summer of Africa. It's hot trying to sleep in a tent. There's no air circulation, and there's a couple guys in the tent. So you have body heat on top of the already African heat. So people decided to start sleeping outside of their tent to get a breeze. When all of a sudden, one night, you hear, "The demons have returned!" One of the lions finally went for it and forced himself through this thick boma wall and made it. So people start chucking rocks and sticks and hoping that would scare the lion away. Now, whenever I think about this part of the story, I always imagine the famous 80s boxing promoter, Don King, standing beside the lion trying to hype him up. Like, "This lion just pushed through several feet of prickly walls. Sticks and stones will not break this champ's bones." And they didn't, because the lion just snatches a guy and rushes through the wall. And this time they changed their game. The people knew there were 2 lions from the prints they left, but one would always come in and the second one would stay in the jungle for the lion to return. This time the second lion was waiting on the other side, and they just dined on this dude like a few feet from the walls. Like, the men of the camp are screaming, and they can hear the lions on the other side just chewing on their comrade, and they try and fire shots at him, but it's just too dark to see. And they're afraid, really, to go out and get a clear shot, because they're afraid if they go out in the darkness, the lion's just going to snag them and start eating them. So morning comes, and there, just a few feet outside the camp, lies their half-eaten companion. So Patterson orders his men not to move the body. It's half-eaten. They're gonna come back for it. And we can just set up and have a marksman's advantage to shoot these demons. So all day long, this corpse is just baking in the African sun. And I'm sure that smell was horrible. And what's even worse is probably what's going on in the mind of these workers. I'm sure it is a mind game like you wouldn't believe going on. They suffered horrible nights. I can't even imagine every night you lay down, you're afraid you're going to be eaten in your sleep. I'm sure the day at least provided some solace to you. Like, I'm sure it was terrible working on a railroad in Africa in 1898, but at least you didn't have to worry about the lions eating you in your bed. But now they're confronted with it, man. Here's the corpse of their buddy just sitting there rotting. And the bad thing is, after seeing all that, the lions didn't come back for the corpse. So the day was a chalk. It was a waste. So they had to come up with a new plan. So this is going to continue to go on all spring, all summer, all fall. There's several different camps, and they're broken up, and the lions are just going to, easy pickings, man. They're just going to keep targeting guerrilla tactics. And but by November, these lions are becoming super bold in how they're sneaking into camp. They always just snuck in one at a time before and took one dude out now. But by now, both lions are coming in, and they're taking 2 men at a time. There's one instance where they each grabbed a worker and darted for the boma walls. Now, the men could hear the cries of one of the workers for hours, but were too scared to go check on him. When they finally did, they found the guy halfway through the walls. He had gotten stuck in that thick, prickly, thorny boma wall, and it was stabbing him in his stomach, in his chest, in his arms, in his face. He was stuck in there. The lions darted with him, and he got hung up, and they couldn't get him out. So the lions on the other side had bit his feet and tried to pull him through, and it only made him more stuck. So they just ate his feet and legs and left him in the prickly walls. So by this point, the workers are done. They've had enough. The majority of the camp leaves. And when they leave, one of them told Patterson, "I came here to work for the government, not to supply food for lions or devils." So the Uganda Railway Committee has to do something. Production has stopped. This railroad is not getting built. So they have to come up with a solution. So they notified Patterson that the district officer will be there the following day to discuss what needs to be done. Now, as it would turn out, the next day, nothing happened. No train showed up, no district officer. So it's getting nighttime. Patterson decides, I better go out to the guard tower. I'll sit up there with a rifle for the night and see if I can keep an eye out for the lions. After a few hours, he hears them start roaring pretty close to camp. Now, he can hear them start eating. But he knew no one from the camp had been taken, because if they had, the whole camp would be in a panic. So surely no one from their camp has been taken, but something or someone is being snacked on by these lions. Now, for hours go by, and he's just sitting there and just listening to them chomp. And they finish their meal, and they slink off into the distance. Now, in the morning, Patterson comes down from the guard tower, and he runs into the district officer who was absent the day before. Apparently, what had happened was the train arrived late, and their party couldn't make it to camp before dark, so they tried to push on and try and just go ahead and make it there. Well, the back of the officer's shirt would tell the grim tale of what happened. You know, like when the district officer arrived there, he had a long claw mark on the back of his shirt, and his shirt was being soaked up with blood. Apparently, what had happened was, as I said, their train arrived late, and they tried to make it through the jungle to get to the camp. And as they made their way back, one of the lions started stalking them, and at the right moment lunged at them, and he clawed the district officer on his way. But he bit the district officer's sergeant that was accompanying him and dragged him off into the jungle. And the sad thing is, like, it's kind of really heartbreaking when you think about it this way. You go back and look at the accounts of what happened. The sergeant who was dragged off by the lions, his last words before the lion lunged at them was "E Bwana Simba," and that translates to "Oh master, a lion." So the sounds that Patterson heard all night long was that poor sergeant being eaten by these two demon lions. But after this, the lions would make a fatal mistake on their part. One of them attacked a local by the river just outside the camp. Now, the man survived, but the lion was currently feasting on his donkey that he had. So the camp would quickly round up a party and go off to try and hunt the man-eating lions. But when they got there, the lion quickly darted into a thicket. Now, Patterson knew this was the best opportunity he was given so far. The lions had never had a chance where they attacked during the day, so you had a good line of sight to be able to shoot these lions. And they knew exactly where they were. So he ordered everyone to get out your canteens, start banging them, shout, make as much noise as possible. And then he ran around and looked for where he thought would be the most likely opening for it to escape. Now, he finds his spot that he thinks they're going to come out at. He crouches down, and he's looking down the sights of his double-barreled gun. And his heart, I can all imagine, dude. His heart's probably beating out of his chest. Now, finally, a maneless lion appears from the thicket. And Patterson lines up his shot. And he fires. And there's no bang. The gun misfired. And in a panic, he forgot that he still had the left barrel. So he attempted to quickly reload, but the lion sees him and is about to pounce. But the lion looks around, apparently, from the reports, and he's just super disoriented by the noise and tries to run off. And by that point, Patterson realized he still had a round in the left and shot. And he hit the lion, but he ended up losing its track, and the lion goes off, and he couldn't find it. But the donkey the lion was eating on was only partially devoured. He'd only ate part of it. So he knew the lion would probably return for this. So they devised a really quick plan and constructed a 12-foot blind so he could hide in it and wait for the lion at night. So he goes up there, and it's silent and it's dark. It's the African jungle at night. So he's just sitting up there wondering if it's going to return. And then all of a sudden, he hears a twig snap. Now, this was a sign to get ready, as he was about to come within feet of the man-eater. Now, he could see the lion faintly and heard it roar as it was approaching. And then it roared again, and Patterson looked, and it was looking up at the blind. The lion knew Patterson was up there. So now the tables were turned, and now the hunter became the hunted. He could see it faintly in the darkness, and he knew it was creeping towards him. And in that moment, he took a shot and the lion let out a mighty roar. And then he could hear it thrashing about. He just sat and waited. Now, a cornered animal can be a dangerous thing, but a cornered, hurt lion is a deadly one. So he waited until he heard the lion give its last growl. And when sun came out at dawn, he hopped down from the blind and tracked the blood trail. And he finally discovered a lifeless 9-foot 8-inch maneless male lion. Now, this might have been cause for celebrating. I'm sure they did, because they killed that first one. But let's be real. There's still another one who's equally as ferocious in that jungle waiting for them. And this has been going on for 10 months of cat and mouse of trying to stop these lions and them just eating someone like every couple of nights, man. So they really need to focus on going ahead and getting the other one out. So they hatched a plan. And the plan they have is to set up a blind and in front of it place 3 goats to kind of bait it out. So they tied the 3 goats together, and so the lion couldn't run off with the goats, they tied a 250 piece of a rail track to it. And that night the lion took the bait, but they placed it a little too far from the blind, and it was so dark they couldn't get a decent shot. Now, this sucks, but what I find crazy about the fact is the lion ran off with all of this. The lion grabbed a goat and supposedly took off running like nothing was holding it back. Meanwhile, it's dragging 2 other goats and a 250-pound weight. It's just insanity. I knew lions were strong, but when I started kind of getting into the history of this, I was like, oh man, that's fucking strong. So the next morning they go and they find 1 goat's eaten, and 2 other goats have been picked up. They've been picked over. So they knew from past experience it should come back because it only barely ate this one. So this time they put the goat carcasses directly under the blind. And sure enough, the lion comes back. And this time Patterson's ready. So he has his double barrel loaded with slugs. Bang! Fires both barrels at once into the lion's shoulder. The lion drops. He's finally bagged the other man-eater. Nope. Lion gets up and runs into the thicket. And it's not dead. He can't find it the next day. He was thinking maybe it would just run off and it would be dead. And he could find it. He's like, oh, we'll get it in the morning when the sunlight comes up. It's too dangerous at night. He couldn't find it. He had just unloaded 2 slugs into this thing's shoulders. It should be dead. But instead, it comes back to camp a few nights after this and started taking victims again. It started eating people again with 2 slugs in its shoulder blades. This is why I love this story. It makes no sense and it's horrifying. When you ask people, do they know this story? No one really does. Because it's a story about lions attacking people in East Africa. Doesn't sound like much of a story there. This was a saga, though. These men threw everything they had at these lions. They built walls. The walls were breached. They shot at them. It didn't bother them. They just kept sneaking in and eating people at night. Like it was no big deal. So, the lion appears to be fine as it's still hunting days after being shot. Patterson is determined, and I'm sure this dude was going nuts by this point. So one more time, they tried the blind and bait method. So Patterson and another hunter would set up in a tree outside of camp and wait. And this time, he had a little more light because it was supposedly a full moon that night. So they're sitting there and they're waiting. And it's probably about after midnight. And he saw the lion approach. And this time he had his .303 rifle. Patterson lined up the shots, got him in the chest. The great cat just howled ferociously and took off running. So Patterson grabbed the gun again and let off 3 more shots, and another growl emerged. So that meant he had hit him again when he's running off. Now, it should be dead. He hit it at least twice with a .303. Now, all you have to do is wait till dawn and track the dead lion. They get up in the morning. They hop down from the tree, go to the thicket where the lion is at dawn. The lion is looking at them through the thicket. It's wounded, but it's still very much alive. So Patterson, with the .303 again, shoots into the thicket, and the lion just lunges out. So he fired 2 more shots at the lion and knocked him over, but he gets up, and he shoots it again, and it's still not really deterring him. So his companion that was with him had a stronger rifle. He had a carbine rifle. So he yells at his buddy for the carbine rifle. Nothing. He turns around. His buddy has bailed. This dude just, when the lion jumped out, he ran for the tree. So Patterson, luckily, gets up the tree as well. And is .303 clearly in doing the trick. Now, if you have never seen British .303 rounds, Google those things. Because if you see how big those are, and it's not bringing this animal down, it's mind-blowing. But anyway, so Patterson's up the tree, and he took the carbine rifle away from his companion and fires at the lion and drops it. And he probably wasn't thinking when he did this. He didn't wait. He shot it and then saw it drop and then jumped down the tree. And the lion was playing possum and lunged at him. But this time, Patterson shot him in the chest with a carbine round. That was the final death blow. So finally, after so many deaths, these man-eating lions' reign of terror was over. So just to clarify, Patterson put 2 slugs in its shoulders, 5 .303 rounds in it, and 2 shots from a carbine rifle to finally end this thing. When it's all said and done, the death count from the lions, according to Patterson, it was 135 people had been eaten. Now, modern research claims it's probably around 30. Where they get this number is from the camp registry. Personally, I don't feel that it's that accurate. As a lot of people that went missing, they just said that they abandoned their post, and the records aren't really kept in the best condition anyway. I just go off Patterson's record because A, he was there and he was in charge of the camp. Now, in 1924, Patterson would go on to sell the skins from the lions that he killed, and he sold them to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And that, my friends, is the history of the man-eaters of Tsavo. Now, if you enjoyed this podcast, I highly suggest you go check out the book, The Man-Eaters of Tsavo by John Henry Patterson. It's the Patterson, the guy who killed the lions in the story. He wrote a book on the tale, and he wrote it's not just the man-eating lions. It covers his whole time working for the railroad. It covers him on other lion hunts, dealing with killer hippos. It's a very fascinating read. Now, I would just like to thank everyone for listening today. And I would like to take a minute to mention another podcast I'm currently working on. It's called What in the World with my good friend Chris Schuler. Chris is going to come on the podcast in a couple weeks, the History Nerd podcast, and he's going to do an episode about what he's currently obsessing over in history. And I definitely look forward to hearing that. Well, until next time, peace.